This is the Birth, Baby, and Life podcast, and we're walking through the chaos of birth in episode number 201. Okay, Mama, we are going to talk about how you have the unique opportunity to find strength, to perhaps reinvent your identity, and just to really step into a feminine level of power during your pregnancy and birth experience today. If you don't know me, my name is Kristen. I'm a pregnancy coach who works with mamas all over the world, helping them to enjoy their pregnancy, grow a healthy baby, have a beautiful birth experience, and even helping mamas create a happy, healthy home full of happy little ones once they've given birth. So let's just jump in today. I want to talk about something. I hinted at it last week when I talked about archetypes at the very beginning of last week's episode. You may want to go back and read that listen to that, because it's a good foundation for today. As per usual, I do have notes, so you'll see me looking down a little bit, just because I've put a lot of thought into pondering into this, and I want to make sure that I bring that to you. So if you think about, we're going to come back to the archetypes I talked about last week, which is maiden, mother, crone, in just a couple of minutes. But I want you to consider another archetype that we have had throughout human history, and I promise we're going to bring all this back to birth. So bear with me. I know that it's a little bit of a higher level, or at least a philosophical turn, but I think that it's really beneficial for us to consider as women and mothers, especially at the time that we're living in now. So another archetype that humanity has held basically from time immemorial is this idea of kind of chaos and order, or in Eastern countries and places, yin and yang. In some ways we think of it as light and dark, though I don't know that I think that light and dark is exactly the right dichotomy, but we've definitely had this dichotomy of looking at the world throughout history. And it's not really an antiquated way of looking at the world at all, which many might argue. If people argue that, it really shows an insufficient understanding, and I think it gets lost in this modern attitude that we have towards suffering, which is that, nobody should ever have to suffer, and somehow suffering is maybe not bad, because I think we could argue that suffering is bad, but that suffering indicates some level of injustice somewhere, and somewhere where humanity has not just failed, but I think the implication is that there is an oppressive force, and often the implication is that the oppressive force is humanity. And so there's this modern attitude that suffering shouldn't happen, and it's not because suffering shouldn't happen because we shouldn't be living in a fallen world, but it's that suffering shouldn't happen because there's an oppressor. And that seems to be a really modern paradigm, and it causes us to dismiss this older human reckoning or attempt to understand our world by looking at this order and chaos, or again, that Asian way of looking at it, yin and yang. And the reality is that life brings both joy and suffering with it. And at least in this world, we aren't going to be able to escape that no matter how hard we try. And so looking at the way that our forefathers and foremothers have conceptualized this throughout time can bring us some wisdom. And I think it can especially bring wisdom through the profound change that is pregnancy and birth, like I started talking about in the last episode of pregnancy and birth as a rite of passage. So I do believe that we should do as much as we can to relieve anguish and suffering, and to help create a world that's more on track for human flourishing. But I also think there's going to be limits to what we can do, again, at least in this world. And, depending on your spiritual persuasion, you may have more views on what will ultimately bring an end to human suffering. But I'm going to say that I think we should do what we should, but maybe not necessarily be angry at each other that we can't totally get rid of it, because at least I just don't believe that it's ever going to be quite possible. So, but let's look at this model of chaos and order, this yin and yang kind of thing, and how that could be useful as we navigate through life, and especially maybe as we navigate through pregnancy and birth. And I believe that it can be helpful to look at pregnancy and birth from an archetypal standpoint. So last week, again, I told you I'd come back to this. We did touch on an archetype that is maiden, mother, crone. And we see this archetype really throughout the whole world. You may immediately think of some examples of it. that take you to one cultural tradition or another, but really you see it in so many places. You see it, in ancient cultures. We see it even in Judeo-Christian heritage cultures or the Abrahamic religions. And that's what I'm most familiar with. So that's what I'll pull on with some of these examples. But you can see it throughout the world in many, many, many cultures. So you have the maiden, who is like this strong warrior maiden. And this is the archetype that our culture really venerates. I'm going to come back to this in the next podcast episode as well. And it seems to be what our modern culture wants to perpetuate. And this woman is this archetype. She's really unfettered by marriage or by child. And she's strong. She can ride out. She can bless. She can shake the world up or make change. Some historical figures that we see that might embody this archetype would be Joan of Arc or Amelia Earhart or Florence Nightingale. I mean, all these women did really different things, but they held that kind of maiden archetype. And they were dedicated to their cause. And they were so dedicated to their cause that there wasn't room for a relationship or for mothering. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's one archetype for the women. And we see these in scripture too, even though some of these shifted. But we see, for example, Esther's story. She was really a maiden on the cusp of change, but when she created the change, she was still in her maiden stage. And then once she moves on, we don't hear any more about her really. And then in the literature, we see characters like Eowyn, who again was a strong warrior maiden, and then you don't necessarily hear so much after that. But that is what she did when she was unfettered by say the cares of motherhood or the cares of marriage. And it's not a bad thing, but it's just one part of a woman's life, and it tends to be, this is the archetype that our modern culture really venerates and actually impresses upon women that they need to continue to act out even after they've moved on to the next phase. And again, we'll talk about that some more in this episode and revisit that in the next. So the mother and then certainly the crone are actually much less valued today, and held up perhaps as something to avoid or something that's somehow holding you back. But history actually does show us that women navigated through maidenhood and they became vibrant in the mother role. Or at least in the role of having a relationship. So somebody who came to my mind was Judith. She's a relatively minor story in the Old Testament in the Hebrew Bible, but she cut off the head of an opposing general, and she was a widow. She was probably somewhat young. I don't know that the scriptural story mentions if she had children or not, but it does mention that she was a widow. So she had been married, she had moved into this next phase, and yet she still had the strength to do this really, really actually gruesome but heroic task. And then we look at Ruth, who, again, her story is similar to Esther's in that it starts off where she's in the maiden position, but you see what happened after that, and you see kind of the veneration that she received as being part of the lineage of Jesus. We see women like Pocahontas, who literally made history with her baby on her back. And we see Queen Boadicea, that's going back to very early British history, and she stood up strongly against invaders who came to her land. She tried to hold back an oncoming conquest. Again, looking back at the biblical record, we see Abigail, who we don't know if she had children, but we're going to assume perhaps she had children, because she was in a marriage with a man who was really kind of an oaf or a bore. I guess, he would be sort of what we stereotypically call a man today. But we see her make choices that protect her entire household from, his really glaring errors. And she did that. She rode out in literal strength. And also we see her picture of strength as a very women's level of strength, that she employed hospitality and wisdom and prudence and perhaps some strategizing to save the day in that story. And then of course there is what we may think immediately of as the archetype of motherhood, which is Mary or Miriam, the mother of Jesus. These women had grace, they had strength, they even had power, and many of them had babies riding on their hips or on their backs when they did this. And then we overlook, I would say probably actually the crone is the phase of a woman's life that is most overlooked. because we really overlook the wisdom of that women gain once they move through that motherhood phase of life. They bring this wisdom, insight, skill levels to the world. And they often have a much greater focus on human flourishing and well-being than, say, the men their age, who have also gained experience and wisdom. But they bring something special. Their children are raised, and their wisdom, it brings almost a level of feminine energy. And I would actually argue that even women who never have children, who reach that older stage as a crone, they tend to bring some of that feminine motherly energy with them, because I think that's inherent to femininity. And I say this as like a total tomboy nerdy woman, but it's definitely there. And it's just a different energy than men have, but especially women who have been mothers. I mean, is it any wonder that you see women often going into these fields that aren't competitive C-suite executives, but rather fields that are focused on human flourishing, like teaching, social work, and that sort of thing? Maybe women aren't going into those fields because they're held back, but because they have this greater sense of wanting to contribute to humanity itself. And I think we see that especially in these older women who have a lot to bring in the form of wisdom to the world. So again, these I feel like these archetypal perspectives of the the seasons of a woman's life, and also the balance of our world, is really helpful, especially if you're a young mom, a new mom, or becoming a new mom, and you're navigating motherhood and you feel excited, and to help you feel not just excited, and there's going to be a little bit of anxiety, which I recognize, but excited and also proud and looking forward to this and this phase. Because we do live in a world, at least as women, where roles and seasons matter. We live in a world where chaos and order do actually exist. And so when we talk about those things frankly, and even look at our journey through life from the perspective of these archetypes that, our ancestry has brought to us, that's wisdom brought forth through, generations of human experience, I think it's worth taking a look at that. So when we look at chaos and order, I think that if we think about order, we can immediately, and looking particularly at birth now, we can immediately see that the domain of medicalized birth is very heavily on the order side of balance. There's heavy control, trying to control birth and everything that might happen around it. And I think that order is a good thing. It can become oppressive and stultifying. I mean, and so I guess I want to say that this order would be more of a masculine energy. And so it's not inherently superior, I think, to chaos. And it can be really problematic. And I think it can be particularly problematic in birth, because while we certainly want to ensure safety in pregnancy and birth to the level that we can, I think when you bring this very masculine energy of order and control, it's particularly damaging in birth, because not only is birth a woman's activity, but it's also, it inherently has a little bit of chaos in it. And when we try and control it, it's like you think about a pet or even a child. We would say if you may break that pet or that child's spirit, but then there's something lacking after that. And I think when we look at birth in these terms, we can understand that when we break and subdue birth to the point where we've created, I would say, the illusion of safety, because if you look at the statistics, are we really creating the safety for mothers and babies that we claim with medical technology? No. But we project an illusion of safety, but we do it at the expense of breaking the spirit of birth and many women who are giving birth, as they will attest to you. So let me just read over my notes here. So, and also if we go back and we look at chaos and say that this is partially beyond our control, that this feminine chaotic energy can be beyond our control, that's not to say that that energy is at all inferior, because too much of the order leads to stagnation and oppression. If you've read any of Jordan Peterson's work, he argues this. Too much chaos can can be disorienting. It can even be destructive. But chaos is also the place where new ideas are seeded and gestated. I chose that word on purpose. And where creativity can flourish. And even where a level of strength that you would never find if you walked completely through an ordered life. There is a level of strength and resilience that you would never find. It's like if we think about if we keep our children too protected and cocooned, they won't develop any resilience. And so we want to look at the fact that we need a balance of these things, and that includes in birth. And so walking into chaos, confronting what you find there, it can bring strength. It can bring definition to who you are. It can bring that resilience. It can bring a depth of meaning that goes far beyond what would be found in a quote unquote perfect life without any pain or challenge or strife. And that place is the place where birth rightfully lives. So, birth, though many people have tried to tame it, this is inherently the place that birth is in our world. And like I said, it may bring an illusion of safety to tame it, but it has crushed many women in the process. And I'm not sure that is a good thing, is a good trade-off. That doesn't mean we shouldn't look into interventions for birth. Even medications and cesareans may have their place. But I think if we look at those interventions and we honor the individuality and the humanity of the woman who's going through that experience to bring forth new life, and also if we honor the fact that it is a profound experience, we can bring those interventions in, bring order in where it may be life-saving without also having the side effect of having crushed something. Or at least, even if a woman still needs to mourn the loss of the experience that she wanted or thought she was going to have, we can hold the space, recognizing that we had to tread a little bit into this or onto this in order to bring an outcome that brought life to mother and baby. We can hold the space without telling her, oh, you've got a baby, and you shouldn't mourn anything else. You should be grateful. So let's at least hold the space for just the enormity of this experience and the fact that this experience is a chaotic one, and even having to bring in those interventions can introduce a level of chaos in a woman. And so there may be additional journeying that she needs to do afterwards to step out of that. And that is not a bad thing, to hold that space and to guide her as she does that. And so if we are open to pregnancy and birth as an archetypal journey, we can find beauty in it. And also as women, we can find a lot of courage in it. As I've talked about over the last few podcast episodes, pregnancy is something that reinvents you. It changes you. It does transform you. Going from that warrior maiden into the feminine strength of motherhood it's not celebrated in our culture. Like I said, I think on the last podcast episode, it's celebrated like from a consumer perspective. You get to buy stuff for your baby. But otherwise, it's not really celebrated. You're told, oh, you're going to lose sleep and you're going to lose time and your children are going to, do this, that, and the other. So there's not this celebration of what it brings to you. There seems to be almost a mourning of what's lost. And I'm not saying that that's inappropriate either. As we make any transition in life, it's good to hold a little bit of space as we say goodbye to one phase and move into another. I think that's why puberty is so hard for so many kids, because you're just like, hormonally thrown into this soup as you kind of rather abruptly or with a lot of turbulence exit your childhood into adulthood. And it is not a smooth ride for most young people. And so, pregnancy and birth can be that way too. And that's one of the reasons why I feel like we get 9 months of pregnancy. Like we don't have kind of the extended turbulence perhaps of adolescence, but there's a level of turbulence, and that's okay. Pregnancy really gives you the potential to be a time of inner exploration. And it is a chance to really shift how you see yourself. It is a chance to shift your self-image and to shape your own identity into who you want to be. So they talk about liminal times or liminal periods, which are periods of transition from one thing to another. And so you're in this liminal space where things aren't quite so fixed. And those places and times can be scary, but they can also be a gift, because when you're in them, it is the opportunity to explore who you want to become, and you have a freedom to reshape your self-image in a way that may be harder to do at another time. And there, really any big milestone can offer you this opportunity. So graduation from high school, moving on to a new school, or graduating from college and, moving on to the next phase of your life, marriage, sometimes losing a loved one. But pregnancy and birth are really unique, I believe, not just because it's this massive archetypal transition, but also coming back to the science, like it is again, kind of like adolescence, it is a hormonally fueled transition. And there is something to the fact that those hormones and that hormonal journey allows us to perhaps harness and explore in a way that we wouldn't, almost a transcendence or, a vision quest or some sort of spiritual journey that we are able to do. And I realize this doesn't appeal to all women. Not all women want to think about it this way, but I know that a lot of the women who are listening to this podcast and who follow me are looking a little bit more at that spiritual aspect of it and the spiritual journey that it can be and the opportunities that it can offer. So you can literally shape who you see yourself as. This is a chance to get the opportunity to explore different ways of being a woman, different ways of mothering your child, the nitty gritty, different pregnancy and birth options, of course. But even looking beyond that and who you want to be, and if there are character traits that you have that you don't like, is this a chance to reinvent that? Because your shape is changing, your wardrobe is changing, everything is changing, so you can reinvent yourself in a pretty cool way. So I think the fact that the journey of birth begins there, and by there I mean with pregnancy and with this opportunity to explore and to reinvent who you are as you are literally changing, blooming, and there's something profound there to consider, that pregnancy is, the lead up to the journey of birth. I think that says something. You have 9 months really to explore this really profound change. And then it moves into birth, which is beautiful. And I will actually say that I feel birth is in many ways ordered. When we look at birth, it's not mechanical like most of your pregnancy and birth materials make it out to be. So it's not like, I feel like we're reading a mechanic's manual, when you read standard pregnancy books or take the hospital childbirth classes or something, it's like, oh, the cervix is going to crank open to 10 and then the doctor's going to go in there and he's just going to deliver the baby. It's very mechanical. Birth is not mechanical, but it is ordered. And I like talking about it from a hormonal perspective because we're looking at birth. We're looking at a hormonal symphony. Dr. Sarah Buckley, I'll link to the podcast episode I did with her below in the show notes. She talks about this hormonal symphony of birth, and there is a design to that. And in fact, when you interrupt that design, when you interrupt that order that birth inherently has on a physiological level, on a hormonal level, then that's when we get some of these complications in birth and need some of that medical rescuing that maybe we wouldn't have otherwise needed. So, birth is in many ways ordered, but it also does bring an element of the unknown. It's why, even if you hire the best midwife in your area, she can't guarantee a birth outcome. Or even if you hired me as a pregnancy coach and we talked every single day and we went through all of the exercises and all of this and all of that, it doesn't necessarily mean that it would turn out exactly as you wanted it to, because there is a step into the unknown. There is an element of walking into chaos with birth. But when you walk into that chaos of birth, you're bringing your baby back with you. And I just think that, I guess, that's worth pausing for a minute and just considering you're walking into chaos, and then you are going to bring your baby back with you. This calls upon your strength at an incredibly profound level. And for many women, this is the hardest thing that you've ever done before. It's the most profound, the biggest thing. Now, I know some of you have trauma and challenges in your past, but for many women, this is the first time you've really faced that level of chaos and that level of the unknown. It can and it will mark you really profoundly. Now, you don't need to go it alone. I'm not saying that we need to go off into, the woods and birth our babies alone, or go into a birthing hut and do it all alone. I guide women through pregnancy and birth as a pregnancy coach because I believe that women should have that support. I help doula. I've been a birth assistant. I'm a perpetual student midwife. I believe in that. And I believe that some women want, they want a doctor, and they need a doctor to help monitor their pregnancy and birth. And so I'm not saying that it needs to be a journey that is alone. Sometimes help is a good thing, but it's really still a profoundly spiritual journey. I heard a story recently, and I honestly cannot remember where I heard it at, or else I would relate where I heard it from. But this woman had planned a beautiful home birth experience, I think, and she ended up needing a cesarean section. And her father had died a short time before, and as she was on the operating table, she was just praying and thinking about this, and she felt really profoundly that she could feel her dad's presence, and that she could feel his love and his care and his protection over her. And so to her, and then her baby was handed to her a moment later, to her, that experience was profoundly spiritual and connecting. And so I give that example because I don't want to discount that any birth experience can be spiritual. Now, I believe that, again, we want to limit the amount of medicalization that we do of birth. And, I taught natural birth for decades, ladies. So, of course, I believe that natural birth brings a lot of benefits, including the opportunity for the hormonal blueprint, for the order of birth, to bring with it the ecstasy and the joy that often come with that experience of having an undisturbed and physiological birth. But I also want to acknowledge that a big part of it is that journey to get to that moment of birth. And sometimes that moment of birth is going to look different than what you expected. But that moment of birth can still be a profound moment for women. And I think inherently it should be a profound moment for women. Birth should be a spiritual experience, because really when I talk about finding your identity and shaping who you see yourself as, I'm not saying that pregnancy is about saying, oh, I'm a home birther, or I'm a birth center birther, or I'm a high-risk mom, or whatever these labels that we kind of put on ourselves in the context of pregnancy and birth. I'm talking about this as something much, much greater than that. It's okay. Like, for many women, the birthplace that you choose feels important. Like, I'll say, I had my babies at home. But this is more about the opportunity to find yourself, and to find yourself in that transition from mother, or from maiden to mother, or perhaps to mother again, and that life-giving strength that is within you, and have the opportunity to explore that in this pregnancy. It's like, it's that chance to explore, to discover, or to even remake your self-image with a new level of wisdom, a new level of awe for the strength that you have within yourself, both life-giving strength and the strength to walk through this experience. Life, creation, all of that is encompassed and embodied in your body is really, really profoundly amazing and awe-inspiring. So if we come back to what I talked about in last week's podcast episode, that birth is a rite of passage, if we honored it as such, if we saw pregnancy as a deep vigil, or again, as a vision quest, or, something sacred and important, like you hear about these monks going up on the mountain and meditating away from the cares of the world. And historically that domain hasn't been there for women, but I feel like, it's kind of built in to our experience of becoming a mother, and all women won't choose that experience, but really it's there in ways that are quite profound, and that maybe have not been as honored, except for when we look at this archetype and we go back and we say, this used to be an archetype that was a respected one. And so, we're in this liminal space that offers a lot of opportunity. We are blessed to navigate into this chaos in a way that I think, frankly, I think this strikes terror in the hearts of many men, because when you think of men mounting up, not the Vision Quest guys, they're not really probably facing anything too dangerous except for maybe a lot of fasting. But, when you think about men, when they mount up and suited up in their armor to go face the hordes or protect the village or whatever, they were courageous and noble, and many of them rode into the unknown not knowing if they would return. But when they did return, it was in victory, but it was often in the wake of death. When as women, we ride forth with courage into our birthing times, we return with life. And I think that might be one of the reasons why men have held us in this level of awe, and at times that awe has been turned another way. But I think that there is just this recognition within them that when she rides into the chaos, she returns with life. And that's pretty profound. And even if no man on the planet ever thinks about it that way, at least you can think about it that way. And you can look at that and hold that and honor the opportunity that comes for you within that. So it's like, just think about it. How powerful is that? How powerful is mother and this role of mother? It's just beautiful. It's beautiful. Really, really beautiful. Okay, next week we are going to dive into a really, really heavy topic, because we're going to talk about abortion and bringing forth life and all of that, because I feel like, given some of the remarks that I made in the past few episodes, I need to address that topic clearly. So we will look at that with the respect for how heavy it is. And I look forward to that episode. I look forward to hearing your feedback on all of the recent episodes. And I hope as you move forth this week and ponder, I hope I've at least given you food for thought to consider that the way that we conceptualize women and women's limits today, and that having children and mothering may be limiting for women in a very practical sense. It's true. You're going to get less sleep, probably travel less, maybe have a little bit less disposable income. But when we consider that the limits are maybe not as real, or that what we get in return may be something more profound, I hope that you'll at least consider that is a possibility. And I know that many of you are already mothering, and I hope this is encouraging for you if you're pregnant with your first baby and you're wading through all these transitions and all this thinking, that you consider that this is a really powerful opportunity to shape yourself in a way that it can be otherwise hard to find, and that it's not just the opportunity to mother your babies and the inherent value there, but to make yourself into somebody that you want to be, and also that will benefit your children and your family and many beyond them as you move through the different seasons of life. So with that, I will see you next week.